If you've got your Bible, let's go to Hebrews chapter 7. And just to kind of pick up, I know it's been a couple of weeks, but just kind of to reiterate, we have a group of people who are living in a Jewish Gentile city. The church has sprung up and is growing, and because of that, there's persecution that's coming. Sounds a lot like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that we've been dealing with on Sunday mornings. And the writer of Hebrews is really trying to anchor these people into their faith so they don't walk away. There's a lot of pressure from them on them from inside the church and outside the church. A lot of the people that he's writing to are Jews. They grew up Jewish. They live in a Gentile city. Their family's Jewish. And so there's a lot of pressure to walk away from Jesus and come back to the Jewish system. I mean, it'd be hard to turn down when your family says, listen, all of this stops if you just walk away from Jesus. All the hate, all the persecution, all the struggle stops, you know? It's also difficult when the leaders in your city are saying the same thing. We'll stop harassing you. We'll stop arresting you. We'll stop badgering you. Just walk away from Jesus. And so the writer of Hebrews is trying to anchor them in their faith, anchor them in Jesus and say, listen, Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. He's greater than all your troubles. He's better than, anything that you're going to give up. Like, he's worth it. And the author has kind of been working through this process of dealing with their Jewish faith and their background and their understanding. And tonight, it's going to be a really kind of Jewish, kind of heavy thing. He's going to talk about the priesthood. He's going to talk about Melchizedek. He's going to talk about a lot of different Jewish things, and we're going to kind of work through that. But he's been building a case. And tonight, what we're going to answer and really deal with is this. How can Jesus be our high priest? He wasn't of the line of Aaron. He's not from the tribe of Levi. He didn't grow up in the temple. So how can Jesus really be our high priest when we've already got high priests? And where we left off in chapter 6, it says that God has given us an anchor for our soul. And that anchor is that Jesus is our high priest. And so tonight in chapter 7, as we talk about Melchizedek, and for some of you, you may have never heard of this guy before. You may think of what? Who? Melchizedek. So this is going to be, new to you. Some people may have heard a lot about Melchizedek. And really, the thing that we need to understand is what the writer is saying here. He's using Melchizedek as an example. But the point really is, I want to point you to Jesus. And so that's what I want to get you to tonight. Don't get caught up in some of the Jewish traditions or Jewish thought or whatever. Don't get caught up in that. Remember, all of this is pointing to answering the question, how can Jesus be our high priest? How is Jesus a better high priest than the ones that we already have? Okay? So let's look in chapter 7. We're going to read through. We're going to work through. If you guys have any questions, comments, as always, please share. I love that. I don't need to stand up and hear me talk all night, but so here we go. Ready? Chapter 7, verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a 10th part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest continually, perpetually. Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a 10th of the choicest spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest office have commandment in the law to collect a 10th from the people, that is, from their brothers, although these are descendants from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a 10th from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promise. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection was through the law, through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also. For the one concerning whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe, from which no one has officiated at the altar. It is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spoke nothing concerning priests. And this is clearer still. If another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such not on the basis of a law of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life, it is attested of him, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there's a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. And inasmuch as it was not without an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but Christ with an oath through the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. So much more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. The former priests, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he's able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separate from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. Now, I know that a lot of that is just gobbledygook, right? Like you're reading that going, I don't even know what I just read. Well, that's why we're going to work through this, okay? Again, remember, he's answering the question. God has given us an anchor for our souls. He's telling us, listen, we can hold on to something that is bigger than ourselves, that's greater than ourselves, that's more powerful than the struggle we're in. And what is that? It's not a what, it's a who. Here's the anchor for your soul, Jesus, our high priest. So we need to explain, who is this Melchizedek character? Who is this guy? He's only mentioned in 3 places in the Bible. Genesis 14, Hebrews 5, and Hebrews 6, and Hebrews 7. That's it. Nothing else. And what we get from Genesis 14 is that he is the king and the priest of Salem. Now, when we find out in Genesis 14, he's actually the king and priest of Jerusalem. That was the name of the place where Jerusalem came to be. And so he was the king and priest of Jerusalem. Now, here's something that I want you to think about that's kind of weird, okay? This is in the time of Abraham. That's a way long time ago, right? Abraham hadn't even become the Israelite nation at that time. He was still Abram. He wasn't Abraham, the father of many nations yet. Hadn't even had a kid. It's Genesis 14. He had just been given the promise in Genesis chapter 12 that God was going to do all these amazing things in his life. Hadn't happened yet. And so here's this guy. There is no priesthood. There is no temple. There is no law. And yet here's a man who we don't know where he comes from, who God accepts as his high priest. It says he was a high priest of God. It's pretty awesome. Not only was he a high priest, he was also a king. Now, in Genesis 14, we get a little bit of this in the first couple of verses of our chapter. In Genesis 14, what happened is there was a bunch of kings that got together and decided to go to war. And they went to war against Sodom, Gomorrah, and several other cities. Sodom and Gomorrah, we know those cities, right? Well, do you remember who in Abraham's family was living in Sodom and Gomorrah? His nephew Lot. These kings come in, they ransack the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, and these other cities. They take all their people captive, they take a bunch of their stuff, and they take Lot. Somebody escapes the battle, comes to Abraham and says, your nephew's been kidnapped. And Abraham got a war party together, and they went and whooped up on these kings and took everything back. Everything. And so he got all the people, he got all the stuff, he got all the money, he got everything. And he's coming back home from that, and the kings of Sodom and the kings of Gomorrah come out to meet him because they're super excited that he got all their stuff back. Well, right before he meets with them, Melchizedek shows up. This guy, we don't know where he comes from, just shows up. Hey, I'm the king and priest of Salem. And it says that he gives Abraham bread and wine, that he feeds him. And then immediately says a blessing over Abraham. And here's what he says. May God Most High bless you because you follow him. And may God Most High be blessed because he gave you victory over these people. And then he's gone. Well, Abraham gives an offering to Melchizedek, right? Now, he gives a tenth of everything that he got from winning this battle. And the king of Sodom comes along and says, listen, Abram, I'm so thankful at what you did. Give me my people back, so I can keep them under my control. I still want to be king. I want to have people to be king over. Give me my people back and you can keep everything. And Abraham says, nope, not doing it. I'll give you all your stuff back because I never want you to say that you made me rich. Because everything that comes in my life comes from God. Done. That's the last we hear of Melchizedek until we come to the book of Hebrews. Except in Psalm 110 when he mentions Melchizedek. So that's the story. And the writer of Hebrews reaches back into Genesis 14 because he wants to pull this guy Melchizedek into the minds of the people to say, this guy models Jesus' life. This guy models who Jesus is. So he's the king and priest of Salem. He blessed Abraham after a battle, and Abraham gave him a tenth of the spoils to him. Now, I will say, and this is just extra for you, take it or leave it. They call it a tithe, and it was a tithe. He was giving as an offering for the priestly services that this Melchizedek did to him. A lot of people say this is where tithing in the Bible comes from. It doesn't. Abraham didn't earn any of this stuff in his work. He fought a battle. So if we're going to say tithing is what Abraham did, then to tithe to the church, you need to go out and conquer cities and take all their stuff and then bring that to the church. Okay? So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but what happens is that the idea is, here's this man that Abraham recognized as a king and as a priest to God. The man blessed him, and Abraham said, because of what you did, here's an offering. I want to give an offering to you for the service that you've committed for God. So this is this guy, okay? So when we look at this, the question we want to ask is, why is this important to know? Why does the writer of Hebrews go back? Now to us, it's a very obscure passage in the Bible. How many of you have ever read the account of Melchizedek? Not many, but So for us, it's super obscure. Like, who is this guy? Well, for them, they knew the name. They knew the story of that. And so this isn't obscure for them. But again, he's trying to answer the question, how can Jesus be our high priest? He's not from the tribe of Aaron. He wasn't a son of Levi. He didn't minister in the temple. He has no access to the priestly ministry. How can he be our high priest? How can he be the anchor for our soul? So he's gonna answer that question for us. So this guy is a model for us to look at for Jesus' life. Now, there's some things that the writer of Hebrews says about Melchizedek that confuse us a little bit because we misunderstand what he's trying to say. He's not saying that this guy is Jesus. He says he's like the Son of God. He doesn't say he is the Son of God. So one of the things that we need to understand, he's not Jesus, he's not an angel, or he's not some created holy being, okay? He is a real human man. He's a king. He's a priest. He's also not saying he's an eternal being because it says that he has without father, without mother, without genealogy. All he's saying is this: we don't know where this guy came from. Here's what we do know. He didn't come from the line of Aaron. Aaron didn't exist at this time. He wasn't a Levite. Levites didn't exist at this time. This guy predates the Levitical priesthood. Now that's important because we're going to pick that up in just a minute. This guy who is a priest before God, a priest to God and a priest for God. Because remember, he comes and has this relationship with Abraham and he speaks to Abraham on behalf of God, right? He prays over him. He blesses him. He offers food to him and comfort and shelter. So here's this guy who predates the law, and here's what he's saying. This is the kind of priest that we need. We need someone outside of the Levitical system. We need someone that's not a son of Aaron. We need someone that is not a Levite to help us. In fact, what we need is a change of law. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So he's not an eternal being. And this is where people get messed up. I mean, I could tell you right now, there are book after book after book, pages after pages, where people are like, no, this is a pre-incarnate Jesus. Well, here's the problem. Every time in the book of Hebrews, when he wants to talk about Jesus, he just talks about Jesus. And if this was Jesus, don't you think he would have said, hey, you remember that guy, Melchizedek, that did all that stuff for Abraham? Oh, that's Jesus. That's Jesus, and you need to believe in Jesus just like Abraham did. It's not an angel, because how many times has he talked about how the angels aren't Jesus? That Jesus is better than the angels. So he's not some holy being. He's not an angel. He's not Jesus. He's not saying he's an eternal being. Here's what he's saying. His kingdom and his priesthood model Jesus. This guy was a king and a priest to God. In fact, he was a king and priest to God in the place where God was going to set his home several generations later, Jerusalem. That's where God made his home, in the temple. And so this man that God called and God set in this place, you are my king and you are my priest in this place. He was God called, he was God sent. And so what the writer is saying, this is the kingdom that Jesus is going to bring in. It's going to be completely different than what you guys are used to. And so we go back to this Melchizedek guy. He's not an Aaron, he's not a Levite, he's not in the temple. It's something completely different. Now, he blessed Abraham and received tithes from him. Now, I want you to think about this. This doesn't shock us because, we think a lot of Abraham. He's, a great guy. He's in the Bible. But you have to understand, people who grew up Jewish, Abraham is their guy. Why do you think Abraham is their guy? What did Abraham do? They wouldn't be a people if it wasn't for Abraham, right? Abraham literally is the father of the faith. And so what happens here is this, he's making this argument, and here's what he says. The lesser is always blessed by the greater. How do you think the people would have responded who are ethnically Jewish, grown up in a Jewish household, learned the Torah, learned all about Abraham? Abraham is their guy. Then they come to faith in Jesus, to be sitting here hearing someone tell them that there's someone greater than Abraham. That's a hard pill to swallow, right? But he's setting them up. Melchizedek is better. And there's somebody even better than Melchizedek that you've already met, that you need to keep hanging on to. His name is Jesus. And so he goes through this long explanation that gets confusing for us, where he basically says, here's what happened. He blessed him. He gave, tithes to him. And then he goes through this whole process to talk about how, Abraham paid tithes. And this analogy blows me away. It just makes me laugh. Here's what he says. Levi, the father of the priests, was in Abraham's loins. And because he was in his loins, Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek too. And so here's what he does. Okay, he's greater than Abraham. Oh, and you guys love Levi. You love those priests, and those priests are telling you to come back, and we're the only one between you and God. Hey, by the way, they also paid tithes to Melchizedek too, because he's greater than them. And remember, he's just a picture. He's just a model. There's someone even greater than the priest. His name is Jesus. And so he's kind of moving them down this road of saying, look, priesthood's fine. There's something better here. There's something greater here than the priesthood. In fact, we're going to get to it in just a minute. I don't know if you caught it, where the writer of Hebrews actually says that the old covenant, the law, is weak and useless. Do what? It is weak and it's useless. Here's what he's trying to get to. Why is this important? You're struggling, you're hurting, you're thinking about walking away, you're thinking about going back to Judaism, you're thinking about going back and doing all the sacrifices and go back to the priest and all that kind of stuff. He says, perfection does not come from the Levitical priesthood. Here's what he's saying. There needs to be a change for you to have forgiveness and life. You need a different priest. You need a different sacrifice. You need a different everything. Something needs to change. And so here's what he says. Here's the something that needs to change. Perfection does not come from the Levitical priesthood. In fact, here's what he says. Perfection doesn't come from the law. Now, they may have understood some of that, or they may have just said, hey, we love Jesus and we love what he's doing, and the fact that he wants to save us, so let's do that, and never really put two and two together. That's why they're thinking about going back. So the writer of Hebrews just tears the whole thing down. I mean, it's crazy enough that he's basically saying, hey, Melchizedek's better than Abraham. Here's what he says. You cannot find perfection in the law. You cannot find relationship with God through the Levitical priesthood. Because he says, we know. Here's what we know. We know that it does not produce godly character. He's like, you yourself know. You lived under the law all your life. You tried to keep the law all your life. Did you do it perfectly? Let me ask you. You lived under the law. Have you kept it perfectly? No, what happens? We break the law, and then what happens? We feel shame. And then we hear, James comes along and tells us if you've broken one law, how many laws have you broken? All of it. Like, you can't even say, I just broke one. And God's going to nah, you broke them all. So there's this massive weight that we carry around of shame and guilt because it does not produce godly character. The harder you try to keep the law, the further you get from God. And that's what they were experiencing. It does not produce godly character. Oh, and you know something else the law doesn't produce? Forgiveness of sins. The law is just and righteous and holy. I'm not saying it's bad. It's good. Its job, though, is to condemn. That's all it does. We come to the law, and you know what the law does? It puts a mirror up in our life. And it says, this is where you fail. You lie. You disobey your parents. You cheat. You steal. You lust. You covet. You do all these kind of things. And that's all we see. And then the law also says, you're guilty, and you should die. That's all it does. That's what God intends for it to do. So it does not produce godly character. It does not produce forgiveness of sins. And it does not bring us closer to God. And so here's what he says. There needs to be a change. And so he's working in their life to help them understand that all this stuff that they've been struggling with and all this stuff that they've been carrying around is because of the law. Because they're looking to the wrong priest, and they're looking to the wrong law, and they're looking to the wrong sacrifice. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. It was scandalous enough for him to say that Melchizedek is better than Abraham. How scandalous do you think it would have been for people to hear that the law is not how you come to relationship with God? What were they taught all their life? That the law was how you come to relationship to God. In fact, the Pharisees that we all hate, the bad guys in every story, right? Do you know why they became the bad guys? Well, they became the bad guys because in 722, when Israel itself completely fell and they were in captivity for 70, 80, 90 years, when they came back, the Pharisees, led by Ezra was a Pharisee, he started the Pharisees, said, why did we go into captivity? Why did our life get blown up? Why did we go into slavery? I know. We didn't keep the law. Because that's what God told them. If you don't keep the law, this is what's going to happen. And then he says, hey, you're not keeping the law, so I'm going to bring judgment. And then judgment comes, and he's like, hey, judgment's happening because you didn't keep the law. And then they go into slavery, and they're like, oh God, why are we here? Why is this happening? He's like, you didn't keep the law. And so the Pharisees with Ezra came along and said, it might be a good idea for us to keep the law. And maybe this wouldn't happen again. And so instead of keeping the law and teaching the law, what'd they do? They took the 10 that God gave and they added 603 commandments on top of it. I mean, because here's the deal. If we're ever close to not keeping the law, we're going to break it. So let's just back this thing way up. God says don't work on Sunday or the Sabbath day, Saturday. Don't work on Saturday. Well, let's define what work means. You can comb your hair, just not 27 times. If you comb it 27 times, that's work and you're out of God's will. Oh, now you can walk a mile, but if you walk a mile in one step, you've broken the law. And so they took what was good that would help them understand who God is, and they heaped all this junk on top of it. And when they did that, it separates them. So there needs to be a change. We need a change. Now, he wants to answer the question, why? Why is there a change in priesthood? Why can't one of the priests that we already have save us? Why can't one of the priests that we already have offer a sacrifice for us? Why can't the priests that we already have do this for us? And he says, because they can't. We're going to get into this in a minute, but here's the deal. The reason that a priest can't save you is he's just like you. He's a sinner just like you. And here's the thing that they didn't look at, and we'll dig into this more in a minute. How can you trust someone to save you when they have to offer a sacrifice for themselves before they can offer a sacrifice for you? Like, isn't that ridiculous? I'm coming to someone that has to do the same thing that I have to do for God to even hear them. How do I know that he did it right? How do I know that he really asked for forgiveness? Well, we know that a lot of these priests were absolutely corrupt. Now think about that. You have someone corrupt standing between you and God that's taking your prayers to God and your sacrifices to God. Does that stain them at all? Yeah. So we need a change. And so here's what the writer of Hebrews tells us. A change in priesthood means that there's a massive change that's happened. And there's a change because we know the tribe that Jesus came from. He's from the tribe of Judah. He's from the kingly tribe. Now, here's another little tidbit of information you can use for Bible trivia sometime. So on Mary and Joseph's side, they were from the tribe of Judah. But also on Mary's side, she was from the tribe of Levi. So Mary's mom and Elizabeth's mom, her cousin Elizabeth, they were from the daughters of Aaron. So now, we don't count Jesus as being of the priestly tribe because that comes from the Father. And we see that, Joseph is from the tribe of Judah. He's from the tribe of David and all those kind of things. But there is that priestly connection there as well. So we need to change. And so here's the deal. Here's what would happen. The Jews would tell the Christians, well, look, Jesus can't be your high priest. He's not from the tribe of Aaron. It's not from the family of Levi. He's from Judah. We know where he's from. And we've never, ever had a priest from Judah. To which we would say, you're right. We haven't. But God made a change. God made a change because what we have isn't working. Now, one of the things that we need to see with this is God made the change. We didn't make the change. That's important, right? God is God. And God decides how all this happens and what it does. And so he makes this change. So there's a change of tribe. Now, Jesus is appointed as a priest by God. Not because he's a Jew. Not because he's from the tribe of Aaron. Not because he's from the sons of Levi. It's not an ethnic thing. It's a relationship. He's appointed by God because he is God's son. Now, the two verses that stand out in here, it's really from the same verse. It's Psalm 110, verse 4. It says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. God appoints Jesus to be our high priest and says, I'm going to do that because, one, you're my son, but also I'm going to do that because I'm putting you outside the priestly tribe because then we need a change. And here's where it gets really big. It says that he's setting aside a former commandment. Look at verse 18. On the one hand, there's a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. That is some powerful stuff. I love the book of Hebrews for this because here's what happens. So many times as Christians, we try to baptize the law and bring it into the new covenant. We say, oh yeah, believe in Jesus and all that great stuff, but keep the law. You got to keep the law. That's exactly what was happening with the Judaizers. They'd come behind Paul and say, great, glad you believed in Jesus. Get circumcised. Keep kosher. Come and do sacrifices at the temple. And Paul says, may you be accursed. If you go back and do that, you've cut yourself off from Christ. Listen to what's happening here. A massive change has happened. We are setting aside the law and the priests and the sacrificial system because it does not save. And we're going into a covenant that does. Look at what he says. For the law made nothing perfect, and on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. See, the thing that I love here is this imagery that he's using, and it would be very pertinent to the people of that time. If you were a Jew and you went to the temple, could you pray to God on your own? What'd you have to do? You had to go to a priest, right? Could you sacrifice on your own? No, you had to bring your sacrifice. The priest had to do that. And the Holy of Holies was in there. God's very presence was in there. Could you enter into God's presence? No, what kept you from going into God's presence? Well, death, yes. But a massive curtain. A massive curtain that was like 4 to 6 feet thick. I mean, you walk in and there's this huge sign, keep out. And he kept us out because he didn't want us to die, right? But did you hear what he just said here? I'm setting that aside because it was weak. I'm setting that aside because it's useless. Not because it's bad. It's weak and useless because we're weak and useless. I'm setting that aside. And then what it says is, I'm bringing in hope so that you can draw near to God. Now, we know when Jesus died, one of the wonders that happened when he died was that 4 to 6 foot wall of cloth that kept us away from God. What happened to that? It was torn from the top to the bottom. That barrier was broken. And so the guy's trying to teach them, and he's trying to teach us to say, listen, this is what you get with Jesus that you get nowhere else. You have access to God. Remember in Hebrews chapter 4, it says to come boldly to the throne of grace, and you'll receive mercy and grace and help in your time of need. Like, again, it's something that doesn't impact us because it's just normal. But could you imagine being a Jew and hearing that and knowing, like, coming to God's throne, not even to the ark, not even in the Holy of Holies, to God's very throne. As a Jew, what would you hear in your head? Come to God's throne. What would you say? No! No! Why? Because I will die. I mean, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. You remember when Isaiah was at Uzziah's funeral and he's there and God gives him a vision and heaven opens up and he sees God's throne and God's robe comes down and it fills the temple. And Isaiah's first response is, please God, don't kill me. I'm sorry, I saw you. I didn't know you were going to, it wasn't even Isaiah's fault. God did it. And he's like, don't kill me. I didn't know you were going to show up. Hey, we don't have to act that way. We can enter into the throne room of God and tell him what we need and ask for his help, and he will grant it. Why? Because we have this high priest unlike any other high priest. Amen. We have Jesus. So, it's a setting aside. Now, he says here, and this is tough, the law makes nothing perfect. It doesn't. So, I love what he says next. So much more. Verse 22. So much the more. I love that, don't you? So much the more. Like, here's what he's saying. On top of everything else, here's something more. Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Jesus is the guarantee of a better covenant. What is that? Number one, Jesus is a better high priest for us. goes on to talk about how that, and we're going to get into this more when we get into Hebrews 10, but it goes on to talk about how it says the former priests, those in the Levitical priesthood, those that, have to, do sacrifices and all that stuff. There's a problem with those priests. They die. You may say, well, Jesus died too. Yeah, but he resurrected on his own power. These guys don't. And in his resurrection, he will never die again. So Jesus is a better high priest for us because he has an indestructible life. He will never stop being our high priest. He never will stop. Oh, and by the way, where does Jesus carry out his priestly ministry for us? Does anybody know? Right hand of the Father. Where do these priests carry out their ministry? In a temple. See, this is what's important, why we don't invest all of our life in priests or pastors or ministers. I minister here. I'm anchored here. Jesus is in the very presence of God. He's at his right hand. That's where he does his ministry. I would say his ministry is a little bit more effective. Now, it says that Jesus, verse 24, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Verse 25, therefore he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And I don't think this is something that I understood for a long time, and I'm trying to really understand now, and I think it's something we forget. Jesus, his ministry now that he is in heaven until he comes back, Jesus all day, every day, and without fail, without rest, without weariness or whatever, Jesus lives in the presence of the Father, and his ministry for us is he's praying for us in God's presence. Actually, it's a little bit more than that. Intercession is more than just prayer. Intercession is coming to God on behalf of someone else and pleading for God to do what needs to be done in that person's life. Now, I want to just put this out there. Does it change how you look at your life to recognize that Jesus is interceding for you every moment of every day? Would it make it a little bit easier to go through the circumstances of your life to recognize that the one who loved you enough to die for you is standing by the Creator, and he's the Creator too, but standing by the Creator of the universe saying, Father, this is my child. This is your child. Look at what's going on in their life. They need your help. Would it change that? Well, the writer hopes so. The Holy Spirit hopes so. See, we go through our lives and we struggle, and I'm going to tell you, praying is a difficult thing. It's one of the things I struggle with the most. Because there are times that I don't know what to pray, times I don't know how to pray, times that I get confused while I'm praying. Have you ever done that? Just be praying and then like all this stuff's in your head and I'm like, I don't even know what to say anymore. I get distracted in my prayers. Jesus never does that. Now, this isn't in Hebrews, but I want to add it in because you need to know this too. Romans chapter 8, verse 26, the Holy Spirit intercedes for us by taking the stuff that's in our life that we don't even fully understand and we don't even know how to talk about. He takes that and prays to God on our behalf for that. Does that help? That not only is Jesus praying for you in the presence of God, the Holy Spirit who lives inside of you, who's going, man, they are struggling. God, this is what they're thinking. This is how they feel. They're confused. They're this, they're that. Let me just share their heart with you because they can't. Now, this isn't saying that you should not pray because they're praying for you. What this is saying is you should have more confidence to pray because they're praying for you. How can you mess up praying when the Holy Spirit is taking the stuff that you don't even understand and don't know how to pray for and he's praying for you? How can you mess up praying when Jesus himself is standing in the presence of the Father praying for you? How can you mess up? You can't. And that's what he's trying to get them to understand. Jesus is a better high priest for us. Also, he's a better high priest for us because he's not full of sin. It was fitting, verse 26, for us to have such a high priest holy, innocent, undefiled, separate from sinners, exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Now, here's the struggle that we have. Yes, Jesus is without sin. 100%. Jesus was tempted, but he never gave in to temptation. And so sometimes we are tempted to think that Jesus can't fully understand what we're going through. And so we want to resonate with people who are like us, right? You ever said that? Well, they just get me because they understand me. And a lot of that means is that what we mean by that is, well, they've done the same things I've done. And so we feel like Jesus can't really understand us because he's not done the things that we've done. But here's the thing that you don't understand. Jesus has experienced temptation to the full. I never have. Have you? I never have. I've never resisted temptation to the point where I've sweat drops of blood and come out on the other side and said, not my will be done, but your will be done. I give in way too early. I probably don't even know what 25% of temptation feels like because I just give up. So Jesus, who went through temptation, the utmost, Satan himself tempted Jesus for 40 days. And Jesus resisted. He knows. He understands. In fact, we talked about this in Hebrews chapter 2, that Jesus became like us except without sin because he wanted to understand. I mean, look at this. You look at the story of Jesus and it's completely different than anything we would think about. Like you think Jesus would come and his family would be perfect, right? He picked the most perfect people and he was born to the perfect parents in the perfect situation. Have you heard the Christmas story? In fact, if you do a little searching, if you go back in Matthew chapter 1 and you read Jesus' genealogy, it is full of jacked up people. He's got some prostitutes in there. He's got some child killers in there. He's got some rapists in there. He's got some genocidal, homicidal maniacs in there. Now you start to think, well, maybe Jesus understands what my family's like. How about just his parents? Like, they were upstanding members of their community and everybody loved them, right? Everybody was so happy when Joseph and Mary was going to have a baby boy. No. Even into his adult life, people were saying, hey, you don't know who your dad is. I know who my dad is. You don't know who your dad is. We heard the story. So he's not full of sin. And because he's not full of sin, he can come into our life and give us the strength and the grace and the forgiveness we need to deal with the temptation in our life. But here it is. The reason Jesus is a guarantee of a better covenant is Jesus is actually able to save us. Oh, the high priest and the Pharisees and all those guys thought they were saving people. Let me heap a bunch of rules on you. Let me heap a bunch of tradition on you. Let me heap a bunch of legalism and shame and all that. And Jesus says, all you've done is tie up heavy burdens and not lifted a finger to help them. All you've done is made them even more a child of hell than they were before. That's all you've done. Jesus is actually able to save us. Look at what it says, verse 25. Therefore, he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And then we talk about him not offering sacrifices for sin. But then look at what it says in verse 27. Because he did once offer himself once for all when he offered himself up. So you go to these priests, and we'll get to this in chapter 10. It's one of my favorite illustrations that the writer of Hebrew uses. He just kind of gives this like frustration of the religious system. Every year, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, you would have to go and offer a sacrifice to cover your sin, not pay for them, not forgive them, to cover them, so that God wouldn't burst out in flame and destroy you and your family. And so you got the joy of lining up, and we'll just call it church, but lining up at church with all the other sinners, and you had to stand there and watch people take their offerings to God. And guess what? You knew what they did by the offerings that they brought. You're standing there with a cow. You had a bad year. You had a bad year. And everybody's like, what did you do? What did you do? But here's the futility of it. You wait in line, and you wait in line, and you wait in line, and you go up there, and they cut the throat of the cow, and they pour the blood on the altar, and they sprinkle some blood on you, and you walk away, and here's what you know. I've got to do this again. And 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 it never stops. There is no freedom. There is no forgiveness. Can you imagine turning around after that and the shame that you would carry back? Now, same analogy. Jesus goes into the altar, the heavenly altar, and pours his blood on the altar for us. And when he pours his blood on the altar for us, we turn around in victory. We have been cleansed. We have been forgiven. We have the chain broken. And we walk out with our heads proud, not because of what we did, but because of what he did. He can actually save us. It says in chapter 10, if the blood of bulls and goats could save us, why do we keep doing the offering? It can't. And so Jesus did what they couldn't do, which is offered his blood one time for all sin forever. This is the thing that people get hung up on, and it makes the most sense to me. It's like, why do you get hung up on this? People say, well, how can what Jesus did take care of sin, past, present, and future? Because he's God. It's the blood of God. It's the blood of the sinless, perfect God who lived on our behalf, who kept God's law. When Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish it, but fill it to the full, let me tell you what he meant by that. The law stands against us, remember? It convicts us. It causes us to stand before God and say, this is what we're guilty of and this is the punishment. So here's what Jesus did. And this is what I love. It only took him 3.5 years. It took him 3.5 years of his ministry to, 33 years of his living life. But he did this in 33 years. He lived a life of perfection for every person who would ever live. And because of that, he fills the law up. He kept God's will perfectly for every person. He did exactly what God wanted, exactly when God wanted it, exactly how God wanted it. We can't do that. He did it for us. And then he pours out all that righteousness on us. He pours it all out on us, and we get to be right with God. That's how he saves us. So there isn't remembrance of sin. There isn't shame. There isn't a reminder of all the things that we've done. When we come to Christ, the better high priest, he actually saves us. And that's his point. That's his point in all of this. Hey, you can go back. You can go back and stand in line with all your friends and family and take your cow. Go do that. How's it going to make you feel? Is it gonna help you? So, this is why I love Hebrews, because it really helps us see the beauty of Jesus and what he's done for us. It really helps us understand that, so many times we get into this legalistic mindset of, I need to do better and I need to do more and I need to stack up the good stuff so that, Jesus will be proud of me. No. That's not how you get to heaven. You get to heaven because Jesus destroys the scales. He doesn't want scales. Jesus destroys the scales. He drops one drop of his blood on the scale and destroys it. No more scales. You are covered in the blood of the sinless and perfect Lamb who gave himself for you one time. That's it. All right. Any questions or comments, or have I just totally confused you tonight?